we have both of our speakers for tonight. So let me go ahead and introduce them, and then I will turn the program over to them. And we have with us Dr. Timothy Siver. He is Professor of Environmental History at Appalachian State University. He is the author of Mount Mitchell and the Black Mountains, an environmental history of the highest peaks in Eastern America. And he's also the co-author of An Environmental History of the Civil War, which he wrote with his colleague Judkin Browning. Dr. Browning received his PhD from the University of Georgia. He is the author of Shifting Loyalties, Examining Union Military Occupation in North Carolina, or that's what the book does. And he's also has written a history of the 7 Days Battles. So we have Drs. Siver and Browning here to speak to us tonight about humans and the environment. But in order for them to speak, I'm going to have to unmute them. So let me do that now. And there we go. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you, gentlemen, and let you take it away.
All right. Well, thank you. I am now unmuted. I hope that means you can hear me. So Tim and I thought that we'd start with a little bit about the genesis of this project, and then single out the summer of 1862 as sort of a way of getting at the interaction between humans and nature as a way of encapsulating some of our book. And I'll start with the genesis story of the project, which I guess you could say actually started in the summer of 2011. Tim and I are both big baseball fans, that anybody who knows us is aware of that. And we had an opportunity one weekend to go watch a couple of Washington Nationals games in DC that summer.
Judkin, if you could speak up just a little bit.
All right. It
Yeah,
may be the microphone.
Speak up just maybe
here,
a little bit.
But
better.
Okay.
That's better.
So, so we're taking the trip to Washington, D.C., and it's a 6-hour drive. And at the time, I was writing a book on the 7 Days Battles, and Tim was working on an essay in which the 7 Days Battles, or the Peninsula Campaign, was part of that story. And we basically spent 6 hours up and most of 6 hours back discussing that campaign, talking about the characters involved and the strategy and the tactics. And then we kept talking more and more about the weather in the campaign and the many effects that the weather had on that campaign. And that's really sort of where I would say the origin of our collaboration began. But the origin of the book itself, that really is all Tim's idea. So I'll let him tell the story of how he decided to do that.
Yeah, I was, I'd been kicking around the idea of an environmental history of the Civil War for some time. And for those of you who might not be familiar with environmental history, let me just give a kind of a quick sort of handy definition of that. Environmental historians sort of take it as an article of faith that people, human beings, don't exist in isolation from the rest of the natural world, that we're all connected creatures, part of a larger community of living things. And we argue that it's impossible to understand people and their actions without understanding that natural world context in which they operate. So that's kind of where I was coming from. And I had kicked around the idea of trying to get at how the Civil War might have changed those relationships between people in the natural world, and for some time. But not being trained as a Civil War historian, I was really put off by the Civil War literature. I think there's something like 55,000 books on the Civil War, the equivalent of one per day since Lee's surrender or something like that. So, you know, I'm not getting any younger, and I knew that in this lifetime I probably wasn't going to get a handle on that literature. And so one day when I was working on another topic, I happened on an article in a botany journal, of all things, that where an ecologist had actually called in a geneticist to help him with this particular project. So, you know, I had one of those sort of eureka moments when I said to myself, you know, well, gee, why don't I just go get a Civil War historian to help me out with this thing? And so then I realized, you know, I had a good Civil War historian right down the hall who was already a friend of mine. And so, you know, I began talking to him about working collaboratively on the book. And we still weren't in any real hurry to do much with it, but we finally managed to start scribbling down some things one day at lunch, and actually wrote the original outline on a little napkin and talked it over, and, you know, things kind of took off from there. So that's how the book came to be, and it's something I think of an unusual collaboration. Historians don't often cross sub-disciplines. We're kind of lone wolf scholars, but in this case, I didn't have the wherewithal on the Civil War to do it, and so I had to call in some help.
So with that, sort of the origin story here, we'll walk you through a bit of an encapsulation of our book by discussing, since if we had been there in person, we would have been doing this in Richmond. And so what better campaign to start with than the attempt in the spring of 1862 to capture Richmond. And so we'll use the Peninsula Campaign and then the Antietam Campaign as sort of a way of pointing out some of the themes of our book. And so to start with the Peninsula Campaign, and it's a pretty familiar story, but so I'm not going to go into great detail here, but General George McClellan finished second in his class at West Point, put in charge of the Union Army of the Potomac, had a bit of a case of the slows, one could argue, and he had spent the fall and the winter not moving the Army of the Potomac. And so finally, under a lot of pressure from President Lincoln, McClellan develops a plan to attack Richmond from the east. He's going to march up the Peninsula Campaign. Although where he actually ends up setting down at the very tip of the Virginia Peninsula, landing where Fort Monroe is today, was a bit of a last-minute switch on the part of McClellan. He actually originally intended to land at Urbana on the Rappahannock River and cut across toward Richmond that way. But when the Confederate Army retreated at Manassas, that plan was no longer feasible. And so McClellan, sort of at the last second, decided to move down to the Virginia Peninsula, more out of a refusal to grant any concessions to President Lincoln, with whom he did not get along particularly well. And so McClellan's like, you know, I'm the military guy. I'm going to call the shots for the Army. We're going to march up the Virginia Peninsula. So he lands his army at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula in early April 1862. And he makes the argument that, sorry, my voice is fading in and out. I'll try to do better here. So, Kelly, can you hear me? I mean, I see Annette's note here. All right. And so McClellan puts his army in motion and gets to the peninsula in April of 1862, has an army of eventually over 100,000 men, eventually over 40,000 horses. So this is a huge undertaking, obviously. And he lands and he moves his army fairly quickly. He disembarks his soldiers, about 60,000 men, puts them in motion on April 4th, and they start marching up the peninsula. And that's about the fastest McClellan moves during the entire campaign. On April 5th, the rains come, and the vanguard of his force encounters a Confederate force that's under the command of John Magruder, who's parked behind a river that McClellan did not expect to be there. It's the Warwick River. McClellan had a faulty map he was drawing from. He thought the Warwick River actually flowed east to west when it actually flowed north to south, and ended up being a barrier to his army. So with the rain and with unexpected forces and with the Confederate commander having utilized the defensive features of the Warwick River pretty advantageously, John Magruder had dammed up the river. He had put 3 dams on the river in order to flood the surrounding terrain, leaving just a handful of roads to cross over the river, and he guarded those crossings. McClellan was facing significant casualties if he decided to launch an assault, and that wasn't something that was really to his taste. So McClellan decides to bring up his heavy artillery and to conduct a siege of what we call the Siege of Yorktown. And so his grand plan at first sort of gets thrown off at the very beginning, and then the rain really exacerbates the problem. And one of the central ironies here is that this heavy rain that comes in Virginia in the spring of 1862, not uncommon, certainly, for it to rain on the Virginia Peninsula in the spring, but it was sort of an excessive amount of rain that fell in a very short period of time. And the irony here is that this rain comes during what we refer to as the Civil War drought. It's what historians refer to as the Civil War drought. It's actually a 10-year period of unusually low rainfall across the South. And during this drought, the climate oscillation had allowed extra rain to fall in the spring of 62. So it rained 16 out of the 30 days in April, which basically just floods the terrain altogether. It's going to rain 10 days in 14 days during the middle of May. And so McClellan's army, and of course the Confederates that are defending, are facing some significant rain. Well, what does all that rain do? Well, first, it exacerbates the problem for McClellan's forces. They don't have very good information about the peninsula. McClellan's chief engineer referred to the terrain as a terra incognita, meaning we really didn't know much about it. He said we knew about the York River and we knew about the James River and we had heard of the Chickahominy, but that was about it. And so they're sort of flying blind. They encounter forces they aren't expecting there, and then it rains a ton. And then geologically, McClellan's army is moving across perhaps the worst place in Virginia for him to be moving across at this time. It's a sedimentary structure known as the Norfolk Formation. And it was laid down back in the Pleistocene epoch, which for those of you who aren't familiar, which is most of us, that goes back to at least 12,000 years. So it's between 12,000 years and 2.5 million years ago. So basically, this sedimentary layer is laid down tens of thousands of years ago. And in the intervening millennia, the York rivers and the James River and the Warwick rivers and all the rivers had flooded, probably usually annually, and had just deposited a ton of clay and sand and organic material, marl, as it's sometimes referred to. And this was the land that they were moving across. Well, farmers had lived in Eastern Virginia for centuries and had managed on the sandy, to the eye, they looked sandy roads in Eastern Virginia, but they had never tried to move anything as large as what McClellan's trying to move. He's trying to move hundreds of pieces of 1,000-pound or 1,200-pound artillery pieces. He's bringing 40,000 horses. He's bringing thousands of wagons. So every wheel rut, every horse hoof, every cannon that goes through churns up the roads and basically turns them into these mud morasses that can literally swallow mules and sink wagons up to their axles. And so, just to quote a Union chaplain who was in this campaign, just to show how these guys, the Union soldiers, were struck by how bad the situation was here in Eastern Virginia. A Union chaplain from Michigan writes home to a family member and says, "Just imagine the worst roads possible, and then believe that these are 99 times worse than your imagination, and you may come near the truth." I mean, it was sort of beggared anything he had ever seen before. And then, of course, you have soldiers marching through this. And as the soldiers are marching through this, they're burning tons of calories. The one study we looked at and we cite in our book says that the average weight of Civil War soldiers was about 143 pounds. And so 143-pound man marching through mud, let's say for about 8 or 10 hours, can burn 5,000 calories. Well, that's a lot of energy they're expending. The U.S. Army daily ration, if they had been getting their full ration, would have been giving them between 3,500 and 4,000 calories a day. But nobody on either side is getting full rations. The rations are stuck in the wagons to the rear. The men are marching out front in the rain, sodden and slogging through the mud. So they aren't getting enough food. Some of the Confederate sources refer to having only 4 ears of corn to eat on the entire day. That's providing about 300 calories to go with all the energy they're expending. And then to top it off, the water they're drinking is some of the most unhealthy water you can possibly imagine. You got a high water table, which means the groundwater is contaminated fairly quickly with human waste. And you got soldiers who are so desperate for a drink, they're taking their canteens and they're digging it, or they're dipping it in the wagon ruts in the middle of the road left by the wagons that have gone through. And so all the horses have gone through and done their business. And so it's just nasty water they're drinking. They're not getting fed enough. it's really no surprise that these men come down with just an amazing number and a wide variety of sicknesses. And so as to not dominate the conversation, I'm going to tag out and give it to Tim so he can guide you through some of the basic epidemics, essentially, that these armies are facing in the peninsula.
Yeah, thanks, Judkin, and thanks for having us here. These things are always fun for us. You can probably tell by what Judkin's talking about here that in our book we sort of turn the spotlight away somewhat from strategy and human decisions and really try to draw on what I was talking about, the connections between people and the rest of the natural world, soil, weather, and in this case also microorganisms. And in any human population, I checked this just this afternoon before I came on, any human population, that includes all of us sitting here, something on the order of 25 to 30% of any human population will carry organisms capable of causing typhoid and or dysentery. So, you know, it's a good thing we're on Zoom here and not sitting cheek by jowl. But we all don't come down with typhoid or dysentery in the normal course of things. And the reason for that is that those diseases aren't really a problem until people get concentrated in a particular area, and the organisms that cause them get passed back and forth through food, through water, and between one human being and another. And if you want to find a sort of an ideal environment for propagating those diseases, you need to look no further than a Civil War military camp. McClellan brought, as I think Judkin said, 110,000 men to the peninsula. About 60,000 of them went toward Richmond, camping along the way. They did not, from what we can tell, pay a lot of attention to thorough cooking of their food. Latrine regulations were sort of haphazardly enforced, and the predictable happened. Men came down with typhoid, with dysentery, and with a whole host of other ailments that were sort of characterized under the general term diarrhea. And we know one historian who's collected 17 different spellings of diarrhea during the Civil War. The diseases became so common among McClellan's men, this is probably about the best illustration of it, and so connected to the environment that they began to label them with names that some of you may remember, things like Chickahominy fever, and especially with regard to some of the bowel complaints, the Virginia quickstep. And probably the best description of, sort of what the Civil War was like with these diseases might come from Walt Whitman, who was a nurse in Union hospitals. And Whitman said the war business is about 999 parts diarrhea to 1 part glory. And that's not all. That wasn't the only disease, the only diseases afoot here. Malaria, as most people know, is caused by a parasite carried by the Anopheles mosquito, the female Anopheles mosquito. Now, malarial parasites have been present in this part of Virginia since the 17th century. But over time, as the population had spread out and acquired some immunity to the local strains of malarial parasites, or at least some resistance, malaria had kind of become a sort of a disease that was seasonal. It cropped up at predictable times, and it usually affected only certain segments of the population, people who recently arrived, young people, people with kind of some sort of other diseases often were subject to it. But when McClellan lands on the peninsula with what amounts to a massive human migration to the region, he brings in tens of thousands of non-immune human hosts. And worse, what Judkin was talking about, the military maneuvers, as they moved these the men and materiel, created lots of new places for water to collect, every wagon rut, every trench line, every latrine that was dug. And water collected there and became standing water, perfect habitat and breeding sites for mosquitoes. Small wonder that malaria turned up by the time McClellan drew as close as he ever got to Richmond. And if you know the story of the Peninsula Campaign, you know that eventually he, after the 7 days, retreats back to Harrison's Landing. And by the time they got there, the plight of McClellan's men was so bad, and I wrote this statistic down to try to illustrate this. By July of 1862, a higher percentage of Union soldiers were sick than in any other month of the war. And about 20,000 men in McClellan's army had some sort of bowel complaint. So you get a notion here of what's happening. And from an environmental historian's point of view, the environment there, the natural world, including the microbial world, has just been absolutely scrambled by this invasion that McClellan has launched. And couple that with the conditions of the soil, throw in the sort of chaotic weather, and you start to see that the Peninsula Campaign, regardless of what you might think of McClellan, is influenced by a wide variety of conditions in the natural world. So I'll kick it back over to Judkin now and let him take it from there.
Yeah, I should pick up with Tim's point there. Just stick with the diarrhea for one more minute, because who amongst us doesn't want to do that? As Tim says, 20,000 soldiers were completely incapacitated with diarrhea. 20,000 out of an army of 100,000. That means 20,000 men went to the hospital to get treated for it. So I tell it to my students today: how bad does your diarrhea have to be for you to go to the hospital today to get treatment for it? How many other soldiers were just deciding to ride it out in their tent and not going to the hospital for it? So you're talking about probably half the army is sick with at least some sort of bowel complaint. And so when McClellan retreats after the 7 days, he retreats to Harrison's Landing. It's not something that pleases a lot of his officers. Phil Kearny got so mad after the Battle of Malvern Hill that he shouted to the people around him, "I tell you, an order to retreat can only be motivated by cowardice or treason." But nevertheless, McClellan retreated, and he gets to Harrison's Landing, and he sits there for a month, and it's not a very healthy place, as Tim mentioned. And so he has these ideas of, well, if you send me more reinforcements, I can still attack Richmond. Lincoln finally, after about a month and sort of asking some other officers, Lincoln decides it's not going to work, and so he orders McClellan to retreat. Lincoln had been influenced by one of McClellan's corps commanders, a fellow by the name of Erasmus Keyes, who wrote to Lincoln and said, "Do not send any more troops to the peninsula." He says to send more men here would be to, quote, "cast our resources into the sea." Basically saying, look at the sickness we have here. Don't bring more men here. It's going to kill them. And so McClellan starts slowly retreating back to Washington, D.C. And then Lee, who's now in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia, had taken over on June 1st and had pushed McClellan away from Richmond. Lee leads his army north, sends him in a couple of stages. We won't cover all the battles in any great detail. Defeats the Union Army, General John Pope, at the Second Battle of Bull Run in late August 1862. And so in early September, Lee makes the fateful decision to launch an invasion of the North. And Lee, of course, he wants to get into Pennsylvania. He has it as his target. If all things went well, he wants to attack the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, and capture that. He thinks with McClellan back in charge of the army, because Lincoln had put McClellan back in charge after the Second Battle of Bull Run, he thinks McClellan's going to continue being cautious and he's going to move really slow. And so Lee thinks that the Confederacy cannot afford to stay where they are. And there are a lot of factors that influence Lee's invasion of the North, of course. Trying to garner European intervention or European recognition for the Confederacy was certainly high on the list. He does want to influence the sort of growing anti-war sentiment in the North in the midterm elections of 1862. Those are absolutely true. He is hoping perhaps to get some recruits in Maryland, and maybe if all things went really well, Maryland might secede. But what really is foremost on Lee's mind in early September 1862 is feeding his army. He goes north into Maryland because the Confederacy needs a food supply for Lee's army, and Northern Virginia has basically been picked bare during the last few months, and there's not much left to feed his army there. The Confederate commissary system is fairly inept at this point in the war, and they don't really get much better as the war goes on. And so Lee thinks across the Potomac River is food. And if we get into Pennsylvania, we can harvest the food, we can gather some of the food in those farms. And so that's what motivates him to move north. And this food shortage in the South, the year 1862, is really a terrible year for growing crops. And there are a number of things that play into it. Let's drift back to the spring again. Remember, it rains a lot in the peninsula. Well, it rains a lot all over the South. The Mississippi River, the Ouachita River, the Yazoo River, they reach 50-year highs, like the biggest flood that those rivers had seen in 50 years. The Tennessee River floods as well, of course, influences the Fort Henry campaign and the fight at Shiloh. And so you have a lot of the farms around these rivers flooded. And the heavy rain in the spring of 1862 causes the propagation of a plant disease known as stem rust, which really hurts the wheat crop and the oat crop in the South. And the wheat crop is hurt so bad that the Shenandoah Valley, which is sort of the breadbasket of the Confederacy in many ways, certainly the breadbasket for Lee's army, the Shenandoah Valley loses 50% of its wheat in 1862. And some estimates suggest that as much as 1/6 of all the wheat crop throughout the South was lost in 1862 due to stem rust. And then as soon as the rains in the spring end, then the drought comes back with a vengeance in July of 1862, just in time for the corn crop to grow. When you'll be harvesting the corn normally in the early fall, it doesn't rain hardly a drop throughout the summer. And so the corn crop in many places burns up in the field. And so you have about 50% less corn crop in the Shenandoah Valley in 1862 and 1863, as well as all throughout the South. So you have bad weather has influenced the Confederate food supply. You also have manpower issues. First, in 1861, a lot of farmers had flocked to the army, of course, took away a lot of the manpower for the farms. And then they thought it would be a short war. It wasn't. It keeps on going. And in the spring of 1862, conscription comes along. And so they start taking more white Confederate men into the Confederate army. So you have fewer men at home to farm the fields. And then you also have a third thing, which is, despite the fact that the Confederacy needs food, a lot of farmers continue to choose planting cotton or tobacco. So you have a lot of acreage devoted to these cash crops, which you can't eat, although tobacco does have its benefits for the soldiers. And so all these lead to this food shortage that helps propel Lee's army north in the fall of 1862. That's going to lead, of course, to the Battle of Antietam. And as Lee's army is moving north, they're hoping to collect a lot of food from Maryland, but it doesn't seem that there's much difference between Virginia and Maryland, but just that ever so slight difference in latitude staggers the harvest time. They get into Maryland in early September. If they could have waited a month to launch their attack, all these Maryland foods would have been ripe, but they're not yet. And so they get into Maryland and they see all this corn in the fields and apples on the trees, and the soldiers are starving, so they just grab them and eat them. But they're not ripe yet. They're green corn, so it just tears up their digestive systems. One observer says that you could track Lee's army by the thickly strewn belt of green corn husks and cobs and the ribbon of dysenteric stools just behind. I mean, that sort of gives an indication of what the Confederacy is doing here. One Confederate soldier, a Virginia private named Alexander Hunter, says every soldier's underclothes were foul and hanging in strips because all of these guys have diarrhea and the food's having a bad reaction to them. And this idea of Confederate soldiers, we have this romantic idea of Confederate soldiers. Well, that romance goes out the window when you think of these Confederate soldiers marching into Maryland, squatting in the fields to defecate or bending over to vomit. I mean, that's the reality of the army going into Maryland. And so once they get to the Battle of Antietam, September 17th, 1862, the real high tide of the Confederacy, most Civil War historians would argue because so much was riding on the outcome. And we know that the battle itself was a tactical stalemate, no clear winner on the battlefield, but Lee retreats on the night of September 18th, and therefore it is a victory for the Union because they hold the field and Lee had to abandon his invasion and go back into Virginia. And you think of it as, well, this is an important battle. Europe doesn't intervene. And then 5 days later, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's how most people think of the Battle of Antietam. What we don't think of much is, what about those poor saps living in the town of Sharpsburg? And what does this battle do to them? And this is sort of the aftermath of all battles throughout the war. And so once again, I'm going to hand it over to Tim and let him guide you through the aftermath of battle.
Okay, well, thanks, Judkin. When the two armies arrived at Sharpsburg, Sharpsburg was an incredibly beautiful place. It was sort of the very epitome of kind of neat, organized, family-oriented agriculture that was prominent in the north. It was a relatively small place. So when the two armies got there, along with the camp followers and the support personnel, Sharpsburg's population increased 100-fold. The human population almost overnight increased 100-fold. And I did some sort of comparison for this when we were writing the book. For 2 days, Sharpsburg's population exceeded the population of Chicago, which was at the time the nation's fastest growing city. Even after Lee's retreat, there were still 50,000 Union troops at Sharpsburg, and there were more people within a 5-mile radius of Sharpsburg than in Pittsburgh, than in Detroit, than in Milwaukee, or Rochester, New York. So in effect, what is created, and this is created every time there's one of these giant pitched battles, is an instant city, larger than anything in the area, and certainly, most of them larger than anything in the South. And Sharpsburg, in the wake of the battle, became one of these instant cities with all the problems of a metropolitan area, including waste disposal. Most of the cities that I mentioned, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Milwaukee, Rochester, they had already moved to a system of waste disposal that involved water carriage systems. That is, they brought in water, had the equivalent of city sewers, running water. The waste from the city went into pipes and then was channeled off into the rivers. Brought its own set of environmental problems, but Sharpsburg had nothing like that. And most people there, just from what we can tell, used privies, and there was nothing really that sophisticated in and around Sharpsburg. And humans weren't the only source of waste. The Union Army had 22,493 horses after the battle. A 1,000-pound horse, and we don't have a whole lot of contact with horses these days. We tend to forget what large animals they are. But a 1,000-pound horse can create somewhere between 35 and 50 pounds of manure every day. And a single horse can create about 6 gallons of urine. This is where environmental historians live, by the way. We sort of live for this stuff. A conservative estimate would put the amount of animal waste falling on the area in and around Sharpsburg at 575 tons of solid animal waste and 130,000 gallons of liquid animal waste every day. Let me repeat that: 575 tons of solid animal waste and 130,000 gallons of liquid animal waste every day. With the streams running low in late summer and autumn, they became subject to contamination, same sort of thing we were talking about Peninsula Campaign. And residents in Sharpsburg reported outbreaks of typhoid, chronic diarrhea. But what was really the major problem in Sharpsburg, and a major problem for all cities, was how to feed this massive group of people who had just kind of descended on the area. And cities where they had become established, they had ties to the hinterland, to the Midwest or other places, so that the food came from somewhere else. Sharpsburg relied on the food right there. So the civilians leave before the battle. When they come back, they discover that both the Confederate and the Union armies have pretty much taken the food. And we have some great stories in the book of civilians coming back to Sharpsburg and finding people slaughtering, or finding that soldiers slaughtered their chickens in the kitchen, and were slaughtering their cattle and their hogs, even their sheep. And there was one newspaper description that I really liked that said, Sharpsburg had been eaten out of food of every description. And so what tends to happen in the wake of these major battles, and something I think that's been sort of overlooked by a lot of historians, is that when the armies leave, the place is literally barren. I mean, when the city moves on, it just leaves this incredible kind of ecological wasteland behind, and the instant city of the armies move on. And there's a great quote from a resident of Sharpsburg that I thought was just spot on with this. He said, describing the conditions, "You couldn't hear a dog bark nowhere. You couldn't hear a bird whistle or a crow caw. We didn't even see a buzzard with all that stench. When night come, I was so lonesome that I didn't know what lonesome was before. It was a curious, silent world." And to me, that just speaks volumes about the kind of environmental experience that the war created. And we would argue that it really kind of throws a different kind of light on the war if you view it in this context. As an environmental historian would say, what we try to do is view the war not just as a military event, not just from a cultural perspective, not from a political perspective, but to view the war as a biotic event. That is an event that challenges ecological relationships and changes relationships between people in the natural world. And there's probably no better evidence of that than the Peninsula Campaign and Antietam. And so if you look at it from that perspective, we believe it really puts a different kind of slant on the war.
And I think that's a good place to sort of wrap up the formal presentation, and we would love to open it up to any questions.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. And that's just fascinating. One thing that we try to do in these programs with the Foundry series is to connect to today. And I know in our conversation that we had over the phone, we had talked a little bit about, since you were focusing on the Peninsula Campaign and on Antietam, we talked a little bit about the change in what people see today when they go to a national battlefield. Do you want to address that briefly?
Sure. I can talk a little bit about Antietam. I think when you go there, there's a real temptation, and with some good reason, to think that you're seeing the battlefield, pretty much as it was in 1862. And to an extent, that's true. I mean, you can still get a real good idea if you're there during the growing season of the kind of farming that was done around Sharpsburg and the Antietam area. And you can certainly get the lay of the land. You can see the sunken road and the bloody lane. You can certainly see where David Miller's cornfield was, where one of the opening battles took place. Burnside's bridge is there. But in other ways, the place is nothing like what it was in 1862. If you stand there and look at the very pastoral, kind of peaceful landscape, and it's a moving kind of experience to stand there. But first of all, it's not nearly as big. They haven't been able to preserve nearly as much land as was involved in the battle. And there are just certain things that are never going to be duplicated on these sites. The weather, which is crucial to this, it's impossible to duplicate. It's really impossible for us to reach back and kind of experience what soldiers were experiencing in terms of just what we've talked about, trying to get themselves fed, trying to stay healthy, worrying about battle, the pain of a bullet wound, the fear of bullet wounds, that kind of thing just cannot be duplicated. And nobody is going to duplicate, and nobody in the right mind anyway is going to try to duplicate the disease environment that was part of this. And even to manage the physical environment in Antietam, just the fields and the woods and everything, the Park Service has to, constantly be manipulating that environment, because a battlefield is like anything else in nature. It's not static. It continues to change and shift and move. And so, they're constantly, on guard against invasive species, and constantly pruning and planting, and trying to make sure that it looks as authentic as possible. And I think one of the great ironies here that we just might mention is that Antietam now has a huge population of deer, because of just the way that the deer population exploded in the absence of natural predators. And boy, what the starving soldiers, particularly from the Confederacy, wouldn't have given to be able to kill some venison for their diet, which was green corn and apples. It would have just been a huge boon. So one of the things we try to get at in the book is to talk about that a little bit, that these landscapes are not just natural, but also man-made. And to kind of suggest that maybe what these battlefields represent is more of how we prefer to think about the Civil War, rather than an actual kind of Civil War experience. And I think that's true of Antietam. I think it's true of Gettysburg, and true of a lot of places like that.
And even a battlefield that, if you think of that, you think, oh, this looks like it did at the time. And there are a few of those battlefields, right? But when you go to the Battle of the Wilderness, and you go to the wilderness shelter, and you look and you see the dense woods, and you can take walking trails and go into the woods, and you think, okay, well, the accounts I read are the wilderness was dense and thick foliage, and that's what I have here. So this looks the same as it did then. And it just doesn't. The National Park Service does a great job of interpreting the site, and they do a great job of trying to maintain the tree line. So where the tree line was at the time of the Civil War. So they keep Saunders Field open and keep the trees cut back to the tree line. But if you go into those woods and you walk through the trees, what you find is a lot of 100-foot tall trees that are 2 and 3 feet in diameter, because these trees are 100 or some of them even older than that. At the time of the Battle of the Wilderness, it was a cutover land that had been used to power an iron furnace a few miles down the road. And that iron furnace had just gone out of business in 1847. So the wilderness that the soldiers encountered at the time of the battle in 1864, it had only been growing for 17 years. What that meant was there was hardly a tree taller than 20 feet tall, and almost no tree thicker than 4 or 5 inches, or if even that. And so you go there today and you see, these trees that you can't wrap your arms around. Some of them are so thick, and the soldiers would have considered that a godsend. Like, if I can have that would be a blessing to hide behind that tree during the battle. Instead, what you realize, if you think of the terms of the trees, nothing's taller than 20 feet and no trees are thicker than 3 or 4 inches. What you realize is these soldiers had nowhere to hide. They couldn't see what they were aiming at. They couldn't see who was firing back at them, and there was nothing to hide behind. It makes it even a more sort of grim and chaotic and terrifying battle to think of it in those terms.
Thank you both for that. That makes it more just interesting to just kind of think about those differences and to imagine that. And we've got some questions flowing in now. So we have one from Cindy, and she says, in light of the terrible conditions and diet, to what did the gentleman attribute the lingering of the war? Perhaps sheer willpower, or what?
You mean, why did the war go on as long as it did?
Why did these guys keep fighting?
Well, I mean, I think to a certain extent, they wanted to win for their different reasons. I mean, they believe very firmly in their motivation, their cause for fighting. But also, I mean, I think to a certain extent, soldiers expected to endure some level of hardship. Now, it was a shock to their system when they realized what they had to go through. But I think a certain amount of hardiness sort of sets in, and a certain amount of, as Pete Carmichael writes in his most recent book, The War for the Common Soldiers, a certain amount of sort of pragmatism, like, what do I got to do to get through this day, and then we'll worry about tomorrow when it comes here. And I think there's a certain element of that allows these guys to, not just go back into battle and face battle again, but to you go back into the campsite and drink the bad water and eat the bad food and deal with a never-ending diarrhea.
And John would
Yeah.
like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I kept asking Judkin that question all the way through through working on the book. I kept saying, what's the matter with these people? Coming at this from a completely non-Civil War background, I must have asked, that question half a dozen times. And we sort of came around to the idea that it's day to day. I mean, and the other thing that dawned on me, which is, sometimes it takes a while for things to dawn on me. I'd always heard the Civil War described as an epic struggle, and all these sort of other cliches that are thrown around about it. I know what that means now. It indeed was an epic struggle for every single individual who was part of it.
So,
yeah.
Kelly, would you like me to? I can see the chat line. Should I take some questions, or do you want to facilitate that?
You can do it if you want. Would you like to?
Well, I just see John had a question that was sort of at the top of the queue, and I just thought they'd be low-hanging fruit. I'll choose that one to start with.
Yeah, go for it.
John Koski, who's a much better friend of Tim's, I'm not sure that John and I have ever officially met, but I've read his books. John asks, how does your book compare with other recent environmental histories, such as those by Katie Meyer, Lisa Brady, or Megan Nelson? And I would say what we try to do is synthesize those works. I mean, each of those works focus on one particular part of the war. Katie Meyer's book on Virginia in 62 for the most part, Lisa Brady with a couple of different campaigns, Vicksburg, Sherman's March, Sheridan in the Valley, and Megan with Ruined Nation, and then of course with her most recent book on the war out west. And what we try to do is to synthesize those works and to bring their discoveries and their arguments into a sort of comprehensive history of the war as much as we can do it within the confines of 200 pages, and sort of bring not just those three works, but all this disparate literature from history journals, from science journals, from geology books, to sort of bring, to really sort of synthesize these things for the general reader to sort of see the war through an environmental lens. And of course, we're making no claim to undiscovered sources or anything like that. We're walking on the shoulders of those who've gone before us.
Yeah, and I think ours is more of it's a history of the war. We've had pieces of the war, and we've had the war as a struggle for resources, and we've had strategy related to nature, but this is the war. This is the everyday sort of grind of war from an environmental perspective. I would argue that it's sort of a reconceptualization of what the Civil War was. I don't know how many people follow me down that rabbit hole, but that's kind of what I would argue. Do you want me to take the next question here? Do you know how long it took? I happen to know the answer, so I'm going to take this one. Do you know how long it took for Sharpsburg to recover from the battle? Yeah, from all indications, it took until well into the next spring and summer. That was a tough winter in the area. And it really wasn't until the streams began to kind of pick up again with the spring rainfall and flush out some of the waste and those kind of things that it began to get better. So, 8 months at the outside.
And for a lot of these farmers, it took until after the war. I mean, they were eaten out of house and home so much that most of these people who were living locally had to move away. I mean, they were basically dependent on charity. There was no government safety net at the time. And so, if all your food, and, if there's no corn in the crib, no crop to harvest, nothing to get you through the winter, I mean, a lot of these people didn't recover until after the war, and several of these folks basically went bankrupt and had to move altogether.
And sometimes, just to throw one more thing in there, the aftermath of these battles, there could be just intensely practical problems. We write about Gettysburg, where a woman came back to find 17 dead horses in her yard. And, right away, you've got to figure out, what am I going to do with these things? And there's really not much you can do with a dead horse. You can burn it, you can bury it, you can leave it. So sometimes the problems were really intensely practical and something had to be dealt with right away. And so the point is that the battle often diverted people from their kind of traditional tasks and sort of put emergency conditions on them, where they had to deal with an environmental kind of emergency, in the aftermath of battle.
One of the questions I see here, I'm going to set Tim up for this, since he is our INSO El Nino La Nina guy. David Kent asks, you mentioned the climate phenomena such as INSO and La Nina affecting weather patterns. Is this the reason why the Peninsula Campaign was so mired in mud during what had been a 10-year drought? And the irony here is that all this rain occurred during a La Nina pattern, which is supposed to be warmer and drier. Tim, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, and this gets back to the nature of weather, and which is, even now when it comes to weather, we don't understand a whole lot about it. We can forecast the weather, but our forecasts are only good for about 36 hours, at best. And so weather becomes one of those kind of chaotic influences in nature that affects the war. But to get right to the question here, it was a La Nina phase in the Pacific, which usually brings warmer, drier air. But that's the usual, that's the norm. That doesn't mean that that's constant. And even the term drought, which we throw around a lot, is something of a misnomer. It doesn't mean that during a drought it never rains. It just means that from a human perspective, there's less rain than what we normally see. And one of the things I tell my students is that, something like average annual rainfall, that doesn't mean a thing in nature. That's a human creation. And nature doesn't calculate average annual rainfall. We do. And so to get to the question here, when you start talking about oscillations in the Pacific, yeah, they do that, but there's also this element of chaos in there. And it doesn't mean that because there's this one oscillation that there can be, that there will only be dry weather. Now, concerning Eastern America and the peninsula in that period, I think the La Nina phase does have something to do with the way the rain fell, in that it was heavy in the spring and then just stopped. And so I think it was the effect of that. But you have to be very careful when you start talking about the climate and weather and the way these things occur, because it's very difficult for humans to get their mind around that, because it's not constant, it's not rational necessarily, and that makes it difficult. So I hope that answered it. And the short answer to your question is yes. That's that's why the Peninsula Campaign was mired in the drought. But there are other stuff that figures in there as well.
See, go ahead, you Tim. You take
I was going to take the next. This is a great question. Are there any environmental effects that still persist today as a result of the Civil War? I'll throw this to Judkin, but one of the things we talk about in our book is Atlanta. We deal with urban environments as well as the countryside. So I don't know. You want to talk a little bit about Atlanta?
Yeah, they asked a question about digging in the forts around D.C., and unfortunately we didn't really research that because, again, a 200-page book, you can only do so much. But what we found was, one of the legacies that you don't necessarily think about is, the war sort of reshapes the residential geography of the urban areas. And the Battle of Atlanta is a classic example. Sherman in the spring and summer of 1864 marches down, encircles Atlanta, captures it in September. But during the siege of Atlanta begins a bombardment of the city on July 25th that lasts essentially a month. And during this bombardment, basically between the bombardment and the Confederate soldiers digging fortifications, the city of Atlanta is basically stripped completely of almost all trees in the city. And then the bombardment ruins the wells in the city center and damages the sort of potable water supply in the area. And so when Sherman's army moves on, and after the war, when Atlanta starts trying to rebuild, you know, I grew up in Georgia, and I grew up, Atlanta's nickname was the city of trees, you know, and that would have been a surprise to anybody living in Atlanta in the 1870s, 80s, or 90s, because there were no trees in Atlanta, basically, because they had all been destroyed during the war. And the destruction of the trees had a huge impact on the environment itself. I mean, a mature tree soaks up about 100 gallons of water, either from rain or wastewater. And so to destroy all the trees means you're going to have some real sewage problems and stuff. After the war is over, when the city of Atlanta starts growing, the middle class, or not even middle class necessarily, but the white residents moved to the city center, which was slightly higher in elevation. And that's where there's better water, and that's where they can avoid the sort of runoff of all the sewage. And all the freedmen population, all the African-American population that moves to Atlanta is basically shunted to the lower lying grounds down near the rivers and the creeks around Atlanta. And so the city of Atlanta builds their sewage channels, and then they end them once they get to the outskirts of the city. And so all the sewage is rushing down into the rivers where the African Americans are living. And of course, it's creating huge hygiene problems, huge health problems for the Black population there. And the city of Atlanta, once too many people move into the city center, then they start looking for other places. And so the suburbs of Atlanta that we know today start cropping up, because there are places where they're either higher elevation or they have better water, because those are the two key resources. And so places like Druid Hills today, where Emory University is, or Lithia Springs, or Sandy Springs, these are places where the white population moves to soon after the water, because they're places that are more hygienic and have better water. And a lot of this is as a result of the after effect of Sherman's campaign to take Atlanta, and things that we don't really think about as part of that. But to the first question, the different legacies of the war, I mean, there's several that we talk about in the epilogue. I'll give it back to Tim and let him choose a couple to single out.
Yeah, the disease environment just quickly stays scrambled for a long time after the war, and you have a lot of freedmen on the move, and Jim Downs has written about this. Diseases like smallpox and cholera and other things, continue. In general terms, one of the legacies is that smallpox as a disease moved south. It was, a disease of urban areas mostly, but it moved into the south, and a disease like malaria moved north. So there's a sort of disease legacy that goes on. But there's also some other interesting kinds of effects of the war. Veterinary medicine as a profession comes out of the Civil War, in part because animals experience diseases just like people, and there's a recognized need after the war in the Army to create a sort of somebody that could deal with these animals. And so you actually get the first land grant universities. I think the first one was it Iowa State? I'm trying to
Iowa State,
yeah, that had the first sort of publicly funded school of veterinary medicine. The Department of Agriculture comes out of the war. We could keep going, and one of the sort of eureka moments for us is we discovered that the National Weather Service sort of owes its origins to the Civil War by a long story, but and one of Grant's first acts as president was to create what became the National Weather Service for a system of reporting the weather. And the legacy that it sort of intrigues me the most is the way in which the war might have inspired American conservation. You had just the natural world of the eastern United States just torn all to pieces by the war. I mean, it's just devastated. Not recovers, but it's at least by the 1870s. I mean, it's wrecked. And Americans, for that reason, begin to look to the West, and particularly some of these majestic landscapes of the West, like Yosemite Valley, as a place to look to for purity, for cleansing, for a land that hasn't been contaminated by war. And there's a historian by the name of Aaron Sachs who's done some work on this, and he argues that intellectuals and artists and others really drew parallels between the destruction of trees that had lost limbs and the amputees from the Civil War, the humans who had lost limbs and legs and, now had stumps. And the West is a chance to kind of start over, to not have that happen again, and to do things better this time. The West is still closer to God's own creation than the East. It hasn't been mucked up by humans. And so we don't think it's a coincidence, and several historians would agree with us, that right in the middle of the Civil War, 1864, right in the Overland campaign, some of the bloodiest fighting that went on in the war, is when California moves, or the senator from California, a guy named John Kness, in Congress raises the idea of turning the Yosemite Valley over to the state of California to preserve it and the giant sequoias and the other things that are connected with it. A number of those giant sequoias are named for Civil War generals, and we don't think that's coincidence either. There's even one named for Robert E. Lee. And if you follow through, it's Grant who signs Yellowstone National Park into existence in 1872 for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, as it says right there in Gardner, Montana. And so we think these things are connected, and that national parks and kind of the conservation and the setting aside of certain landscapes, and I will add that before they could be set aside, you sort of had to prove they were useless for anything else. But the setting aside of these landscapes is kind of a prescription for what ails America environmentally in the wake of the Civil War. And so that's the one that I find most intriguing in all of this. I think there's a lot of more work to be done there in drawing those connections, but the sort of conservation ethic that begins in the late 19th and endures into the early 20th century with people like Theodore Roosevelt, I think can be traced, at least in some measure, to the Civil War.
I'll take the next question here. John asked, we read a lot in soldier letters and diaries about weather and about flies and mosquitoes, and that's absolutely true. We read a lot of it. Did you find any accounts of soldiers encountering poison ivy, poison oak, etc.? And the answer is yes and no. I mean, yes, I have a lot of letters in which soldiers talk about poison ivy in particular, but we didn't include any in the book. So you won't find any in the book for it. But I will say that, there are some fairly famous examples. I mean, famous may be a strong word, but in North Carolina alone, you have the story of Keith and Melinda Blaylock, right? In which in the 26th North Carolina Regiment, in which Keith Blaylock signed up, and his wife Melinda enlisted as a man, and she called herself Sam. And then eventually she is discovered or outs herself as a woman, and so she's released from the army. Well, Keith wants to get out as soon as his wife gets out, and so he's stationed at the time in eastern North Carolina, and he goes and rolls around naked in a bunch of poison ivy and give it a couple of days. And he's got a whole, I can only imagine what he looked like, because I got a touch of poison ivy on my arm right now, but I can imagine what his body would look like. And so they discharge him because they're like, my God, I don't know what he has. And so soldiers do write about it. And one of the things that I find, I tell students all the time, that soldier letters are great sources of information, because soldiers like writing about what we would think of as the mundane, but it gives you a great picture of the time. The two things that are most on soldiers' minds are the weather and hunger. So their letters always start like, damn, it's hot and I'm hungry. And so once you get past that, then you can kind of find out what else is going on in the area. So Tim, you want the next one? It's from Howell.
Yeah, this is from Howell Kaiser, who's a former graduate student at Appalachian State. So, I got to get in a plug for the old home base there. He says, on a psychological level, in what ways did a Union soldier's imagined understanding of the Southern environment impact and challenges experienced during the war? Have historians explored the idea of real versus imagined environments? I'll take a quick shot at that one and then give it to Judkin. Northerners feared the Southern environment in lots of ways. They were particularly afraid of yellow fever. And as it turned out, yellow fever was a threat in some areas, but not nearly as bad as they thought it might be. And they were concerned about that. Also, just the general kind of heat of the South. There's that we have this incident in the book where a guy, I think it was in North Carolina, somewhere in eastern North Carolina, said that, you know, it's so hot that the devil himself wouldn't live here if he weren't obliged to. And so the heat and the sort of feverish nature of heat, they feared the swamps, and kind of imagined this terror. And sometimes in the case of a disease like yellow fever, that imagined fear could affect, you know, the way in which operations took place. Yellow fever itself was a problem in some areas, but not near, you know, what they thought it might be. So I'll give Judkin a shot at this one too.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think based on my reading of a lot of soldier letters, they have this idea that all the South is agrarian, right? That it's all this bucolic farmland that they ought to be able to get plenty to eat from. Of course, it's hard to eat cotton or tobacco. And the other thing, though, is that it does become, you know, they're sort of imagining of this, as Tim mentioned, they have their fears of the swamps and the illnesses that come with living in those areas. But they have this idea of, you know, the South as this untamed place in some ways that soldiers can come in and replenish, rejuvenate, or tame, or turn to their uses. And they're pretty startled by their experience and the reality. And one of the things that startles them the most is the bugs. You know, if you're a soldier from Maine or from Wisconsin, you're not going to encounter nearly the number and the length, you know, the time length of activity for mosquitoes and the flies and the gnats and the things of that nature. And so they're constantly tormented by those things. I mean, in one of the previous book I wrote, just in Eastern North Carolina, I found like 6 different references to mosquito, like 6 different ways of referring to mosquitoes. I mean, it's because it was so, you know, unusual to them. And then the heat. I mean, they had certain expectation that it was going to be hotter, but it's one thing to realize, oh, it's 90 degrees, and it's another thing to realize, oh, it gets above 90 degrees on Memorial Day, and it stays above 90 degrees until Labor Day, and I wasn't quite ready for that. And none of the water here is safe to drink. So that's fun. So I mean, I think it was a bit of an adjustment for them. I think that covers the questions.
I think it does too. So thank you both for joining us tonight and giving us such a fascinating conversation about humans and the environment. And again, my apologies to everyone out there about our slight glitch as far as timing goes. We typically start Foundry at 6, but have a 30-minute mix and mingle. So we forgot to kind of update that with the new virtual format. But I think it's been an excellent evening. I hope everyone has enjoyed it. And join us on June 8th at 6:30 for John Koski on the Jefferson Davis Monument. And if anybody is interested in learning more about this topic, environmental history of the Civil War, you can purchase their book. I put the link in the chat, and it's available through UNC Press and also on Amazon.
Hold it up here.
Yeah, there we go. There we see how it looks.
I'm backwards here. There we go.
Well, thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening and a great rest of the week.